It's so nice to see some familiar faces on here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the fourth installation of the Fashion Studies Alliance series, Getting to Know. And today I'm delighted to have the chance to speak to my friend and colleague, Dr. Julia Petrov, who is the curator of daily life and leisure and acting head of history at the Royal Alberta Museum in Edmonton, Canada. And as if that's not enough, she also teaches and supervises students of dress history and material culture at the University of Alberta. She is the exhibition reviews editor for Dress, which is the journal of the Costume Society of America, as I'm sure many of you know. And she's also on the editorial board of ZoneModa journal. Julia co-edited Fashioning Horror, Dressing to Kill on Screen and in Literature, which was published in 2017. And she's the author of Fashion History Museums, Inventing the Display of Dress, published in 2019. Both of those are from Bloomsbury. And I know I'm eager to learn more about Julia's work, both on these books and on other projects. But for anyone who's familiar with the Getting to Know series, we're going to begin by asking a few questions about Julia's career path and her early interest in fashion studies. So we'd really like to know, Julia, where you began your research in this field.
Oh my God. Well, I've been interested in fashion since I was little. I was an only child and didn't have a ton of toys. So I had some dolls and I would make them dresses. And when I say make, I mean I would tie plastic bags onto the front of their bodies. So like I wasn't very good. And so my grandma finally taught me how to sew, and I realized that I was less interested in working with like the stretch fabrics and more interested in working with, like old vintage scarves and things like that. And went to so my grandparents lived in Boston, and I would go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston all the time. And the bookshop had a lot of really cool books, and they had these paper dolls that were based on 1890s Boston Globe fashion illustrations. I'm sure many of you have that book. And I just got really inspired, and I realized that my Barbie dolls were like the perfect shape for that. So I started making historical dresses for my Barbie dolls. I should have brought some up, actually. They're still in my basement. And then I don't know. I didn't realize I could do this as a career until there was a fashion historian. He's still around, Ivan Sayers. He used to be a curator at the Royal BC Museum in Vancouver, or in Victoria. And so he came to town with his private collection. He does these historical fashion shows. And I was like 14 years old, and I went to this, and I thought, oh my God, you can get paid for this. This is crazy. And so I was always really interested in fashion. I really loved going to museums, and I was lucky enough to have college profs who were like, you should write about this, about this stuff, you should do some research, you should meet the right people. And when I was in my third year of university, I went on a Costume Society of America study tour to England, and I was by far the youngest person on this trip, like by far. And the two organizers, the late Joy Emery and Whitney Blazin, they kind of took me by both arms and were like, well, if you're here, you must be interested in doing this for a career. So let's introduce you to some people. And so they introduced me to people like people at the University of Winchester, which then had the Conservation Center. They introduced me to Lou Taylor. They introduced me to Aileen Ribeiro. And I had no idea. Like this was a whole new world for me. Right? I'm just a little girl from Calgary, Alberta, which is a cowboy town. So this whole idea that there was other people out there that were interested and did this and did it seriously and really well was fabulous. So I did my undergrad in art history and museum studies. And then because of Joy and Whitney, I was able to have interviews with various institutions in the UK. I ended up choosing the University of Brighton because me and Lou just really got each other immediately. And Lou opened my horizons. She was, I don't know if anybody's ever met Lou Taylor or seen her speak. She is so full on. Like, she is enthusiastic. She wants you to do it right, but she will throw ideas at you. And that is what my experience was like. I would go for supervision meetings. She would kind of like throw all these books and things at me, and I would take them away, and I would just, you know, be swimming in this stuff all day long. It was fantastic. So the project that I ended up working on for my master's was, okay, so I was procrastinating on the internet, and I came across the scans of this 1913 book that the V&A put out of the collection that Harrods gave to them. And these hideous pictures of these models wearing antique dresses in these kind of antique-y, old-timey settings. And I was appalled, but also fascinated. And so I went to Lou, and Lou's like, oh yes, well, I've written about that, but you know, there's more to say, because Lou's written about everything. And and you know, she was really generous with her sources. And so I ended up writing about these early collections that ended up being the nuclei of the major museums in the UK, like the V&A and the Museum of London. And it turns out that these were all painters. They all knew each other. They were members of a club called the Carnousers Club. They had a song. I mean, these people were amazing. Their minute books are in the British Library. So I got really into these guys, but that was the kind of the collecting angle of it. But what had initially interested me was that book with the models actually wearing the clothes, and when it actually went to the museum. And so when I started thinking about a PhD project, I really wanted to get back to that part of the equation. And so what happened was that I finished my master's, I went back to Canada, and I got the opportunity to work at the University of Alberta with their clothing and textile collection, and to teach. And I was teaching, and then my contract got renewed. And so I had initially wanted to go back to Brighton and to study with Lou, but because I was working, a better option ended up being the University of Leicester, which had a part-time distance learning option. So I started my PhD part-time under Sandra Dudley, who is an anthropologist who's really interested in materiality and objects, and was a really great fit in a very different way than Lou had been. And so, yeah, I started part-time, and then eventually I was lucky enough to get funding and was able to complete the PhD full-time. And so fashion history and museums is based on my PhD work, although it's been quite significantly expanded.
That is fascinating. And I didn't actually realize that you had that connection with Lou, which I love, because I feel like she's such a legend in our field. And I don't know if I'd ever met her, but she was at a conference that I was speaking at when I was in the very early stages of one of my projects. And she didn't ask any questions during the Q&A, but then she waited to speak to me afterward, and I was like, oh no, this is it. She's gonna tell me this is insane. But in fact, she was completely supportive and really kind, and it was probably honestly one of the best compliments I've ever received. So, but it's great because she's exactly that person who will tell it like it is and really kind of like push it forward.
Exactly. And that's what I needed at the time, right? I needed someone who was full of enthusiasm, was full of that kind of can-do, go-get-'em sort of attitude, because I was so new to it. I really didn't know anything about the field, and she literally wrote the books about it. So
right.
It was so good to work with her and kind of rely on her confidence as I was building up my own confidence, right? And she, like she's written about most things, but she's so generous about like, well, there's a lot more than what I've worked on, so go ahead and do it, which, you know, that's all you can ask for, really.
Yeah, that generosity is so important too. I always say there's room for everybody and everyone can have their own angle. So this idea that we can't touch upon the same subjects just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, your supervisor, Amy Delahaye, I was in contact with her when I was looking at PhD programs as well. And, you know, I knew she was really interested in the history of fashion curation. She had already started work on what became the Exhibiting Fashion book. And I was very tentative because I was like, well, I don't want to step on your toes. You know, this is something that I'm interested in, but, you know, you were here first. So like, I'm totally cool with this, right? And she's like, no, it's a broad church. There's lots of opportunities and lots of things, lots of angles to take, and lots of uh, material to dig through.
Exactly, yeah. And I always feel that I recommend both of those books, both Amy and Judith, and Jeff's book, and also yours, because they do cover similar material in very different ways and are each useful in different ways.
Yeah. And there's more to do.
Exactly, yeah. I know you've covered a little bit of this, but is there a particular part of your career or experience that made a more significant impact on you, or was especially motivating?
I mean, yeah, Lou.
Lou.
But also my stint working at the university, because I had come out of my master's. I applied immediately because of the way the funding cycle works. You have to apply for PhD, for Canadian funding. You have to apply for PhD funding like right in the fall in order to get the results the next spring. So I finished my master's. I applied for funding right away. But then I was offered a job. And in fact, I accepted the job. So I got the job offer on the same week that I got the results for the funding. And I'm probably like the only person who declined this funding in the history of the funding. But I thought, I don't want to have my PhD and not have any work experience whatsoever at the end of it. And it was such a good fit because it was both the collection side of it, the curatorial side, but also the teaching side of it. And I thought, I'm going to be able to check which one I want to do. Do I want to go into the kind of academia portion? Do I want to do the curatorial portion? You know, what is it? And actually, I like both. But that was an amazing opportunity because suddenly I was in this professional realm. I was doing the stuff that I was researching, and I started to understand the relevance and what kinds of things people who are working in the field would want to know. And so when I was reapplying for the funding, and when I was presenting my work at conferences, etc., I could make a much better case for why my work was relevant, which I think is quite hard for a lot of grad students. It's like, well, it's interesting, but why is it relevant? And so it was a really formative experience for me that way, thinking about, okay, well, how does this really play out in the real world?
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about that collection too? I don't know too much about it.
So the collection is a fairly typical university museum collection in the sense that it is part of formerly home economics, now called human ecology collection. So when home economics started to be a field in North America in particular, one of the important teaching aids that a lot of these departments started were teaching collections. And teaching collections exist in multiple contexts across universities. So the collection was started in the early 70s. It was, the older stuff is mostly purchases from dealers, from antique stores, etc. And then obviously donations and field work that had been conducted by the different profs over the decades, who did field work in places like Guatemala, like Indonesia. So textiles as well as fashion, and used for teaching all sorts of things, whether that's construction methods, whether that's history of dress, whether that's conservation, even surface design. So examples being brought out for classes to really make it clear for students, A, how people in the past have done this, B, for inspiration, and C, for really practical kind of handling, hands-on type activities. So the collection is huge. I don't know what the numbers are now, but it was about 30,000 when I was there 10 or 12 years ago. So there's a dedicated curator, there's a dedicated collections manager, and a small exhibition space attached to it as well. So it's, I think it's the only one of two in Canada now, teaching costume and textile collections. So it's a really wonderful resource. And it's a wonderful resource for us at the museum now as well, because we get to collaborate with them quite frequently.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't realize that. How cool.
Yeah, well, a lot of the graduates of the program, well, a lot of the students in the program come to us as volunteers. They come to us as summer students. My predecessor was a graduate of the program, and my assistant curator is also a graduate of the program. So there's like these really strong institutional links between the two collections. We try and maintain those.
Well, I'm gonna actually go a little rogue then and
Okay.
ask you before we get to our final question, and then I know you have some material to share. Can you tell us about your position now? Because I think your title is so interesting, and I didn't realize that was your title until I got your bio.
Well, my title has recently changed, but so I work for the Provincial Museum, which for anybody in the States is like a state museum, I guess. It's a social history and natural history museum that tells the story of the people and the province of Alberta. And so we have both the natural history side and the human history side. There's 13 curatorial programs as a whole. And my initial title when I was hired was Curator of Western Canadian History, which doesn't mean a lot, but was basically settler history and included both home stuff and work stuff. But the collection that I was responsible for was something like 90,000 objects, which is enormous. It's way too big, especially in comparison with my closest colleagues who had collections of like half or a third of that. So we redivided the labor a little bit. And so we now have, on the human history side, there's archaeology, anything that comes out of the ground. Indigenous studies, used to be called ethnology, but now called Indigenous studies. And then 3 programs broadly under history, of which I'm acting head. So I'm kind of like a department chair, as well as my curatorial work. So we have military and government history, we have work life and industry, and we have daily life and leisure. So it's basically the context in which the social history material was used. So we don't divide the collection by material. So it's not like there's a curator of firearms or a curator of textiles or a curator of, I don't know, whatever other human history categories there generally are in museums, or art, whatever. We collect it by context and by use. So my collection, obviously, because it's daily life and leisure, includes an enormous amount of clothing and textiles, like from household materials to religious costumes to like Masonic uniforms to just clothing of everyday people, theatrical costumes, all sorts of things. But that's not the primary way in which we look at that material. We try to tell a kind of a cohesive story. So although we have a textiles gallery in the museum, which we have largely because of the conservation needs of clothing and textiles, you know, they can't be on display for as long as other kinds of materials. Generally, our interpretive methods or our interpretive scheme goes across the categories of different materials.
That's so interesting. What a cool way to think about curating, and you must be learning about so many other types of objects as you go through your daily work.
We have to be generalists. Like, yeah, it was much harder when I was curator of everything. Because honestly, I don't know very much about the history of mining. Like but narrowing it down to daily life and leisure is a little bit easier. And also our collecting mandate, we don't generally collect typologically anymore. We used to when we started as a museum. I think most museums But now we collect based on stories. So a lot of the information I get comes from the people that used it or from the people that knew the people that originally used it. So we get these lovely stories, and that's my favorite part of the job, is just hearing people's reminiscences.
I love that too, as I'm sure you know. And I think nowadays, the museum at FIT, because we have different ways to organize content and material, and because we're thinking about things more systematically than perhaps all museums, not just my museum, did in the past, we are focusing more on those sort of personal narratives, so there's not that question of why was this dated 1954, you know, like we have some more content, but I think it's also such rich content for visitors, because that idea of being able to engage with an object and identify with something, I'm sure particularly for your museum, but I think for any kind of curator of dress or fashion in general, that's really important content.
Yeah, and it's relatable, right? It's suddenly not like, why should I care about this? You care about it because it's somebody's story. I think we, as humans, are social and we're empathic, and we want to be able to connect with people as people. So yeah, I really enjoy bringing that forward.
What are some upcoming projects you can share with us, or current research, or anything that you're really into at the moment?
So I am expanding on some of my research for fashion history museums for an encyclopedia article. Beverly Lemire, Georgia Riello, and Christopher Berard are doing the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Fashion. And so I'm writing a chapter on the display of dress for them. So that, I don't exactly remember when that's supposed to come out, probably next year. I'm still writing. So that's the kind of the next deadline I have. And then I know you had Alison Matthews David on a couple weeks ago, and so she's organizing the Fashion Crimes conference. So I definitely want to partake in that, because I am in my myriad of other interests obsessed with Sherlock Holmes, and so I'm writing a thing about Sherlock Holmes and disguise and clothing in the canon of those stories and books. So I don't know, it's just a fun thing that I want to do. And then after that, probably there's other curatorial projects that I'm working on. So we're working on an exhibit about pants for the textile gallery. So hoping to open that up hopefully next year, maybe late this year. So yeah, lots on the go.
Yeah, sounds like it. And I know you have some visual goodies to share with us as well.
I guess it depends on what you want to see. I've sort of brought all my publications, but we could talk about fashioning horror, I guess.
Yeah, this one I don't think we've ever discussed what got you interested in this topic. I really wanted to contribute to this book, but as usual, I had no time. So I'd love to hear more about it.
So fashioning horror came out of, okay, so Alison Matthews David published Fashion Victims. And on social media, I saw the kind of visuals for it, and someone said, oh, it's so gruesome with the burning ballerinas, etc. And I commented something about like, wouldn't that make a fun horror movie? And then, like sometimes a light bulb sort of goes off and you're like, wait a minute. And I started thinking about sort of the role of costume in horror movies and generally in kind of Gothic and sensation literature. And I am not a horror movie person as such. I mean, I've seen the classics, but I'm not, like really into it. But I do know fashion. And so I approached my good friend and someone I did my PhD with, Gudrun Whitehead, who has a background in folklore and English studies, who loves horror movies. And I was like, hey, we could be the dream team. Let's do this thing. And both of us at the time were working on our own monographs, but when you publish your own book, your first book especially, it's scary, right? Like it's your baby. There's so much invested in it. So We wanted to do something fun, lower stakes in that way, in the sense that it's not totally tied into your identity as a researcher. And so we put together a call for papers. We got some really wonderful ideas from that. Some people dropped out, other people dropped in. And then we worked really, really closely with the authors to craft an anthology that would sort of have these connections flowing through the chapters. So honestly, the chapters went through, some people were lucky enough to get away with 3 drafts. Most people went to 5.
Ooh.
Like, that is how close we worked with people to write and rewrite and craft. And I think it's a really strong, if I say so myself, anthology that really goes through the history. Like, we go through from the medieval period and tomb sculptures all the way to Frankenstein, to TV adaptations like Hannibal, to things like Halloween costumes, to Jack the Ripper, like really the whole gamut. And there were so many ideas, and I know lots of people wanted to contribute but weren't able to, that I feel like we really need to do a second volume.
Yeah, or was there any kind of conference, or would you think about doing a conference on the topic?
We didn't do a conference. We just wanted to kind of write about it. But yeah, a conference would be super fun. I mean, in this COVID world, it's hard to plan, but yeah.
Yeah. Unless we did this kind of conference.
Exactly. Just, a possibility for sure. So yeah, so that kind of brings together my interest in, obviously not just the material fashion, but also written fashion, because I like to read a lot, and I enjoy thinking about what the things that are being described on the page look like.
Fantastic.
Yeah. What else should we talk about?
Yes, please. And I'm just going to preface this by saying this is probably my very favorite book from our field of all time. I think I got like an advanced version of it, but I can't remember why. But anyway.
Because you wrote a letter for me for funding.
Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay.
Yes. I applied to the Passold Research Fund for a subvention on the cost of images, and you wrote me a letter of reference for that.
Yes.
So naturally you got, so because of you, we were able to get these lovely full color illustrations.
Fantastic. Well, partly because of me, also because of your amazing topic.
Yes.
But this is actually something I'm very curious about, because one of the things I loved about the book was the breadth of images. And I think this is something you've been searching for years, right?
Yes. So I have as I said, my undergrad degree was in art history. I'm a visual person. That's how I think. That is how my memory works. Like, if I am remembering something, I see it as a picture. And so I was always really interested in this idea of how we experience exhibits in a kind of 3D context. We move around them, we look at them, etc. But ultimately, everything is presented to us as a kind of a picture, because it's behind glass or it's behind a rope, and you're supposed to see it from a particular angle, and so it creates this kind of picture-like display. And so that was the angle that I started with when I started my research. So obviously I was reading descriptions, etc. But because of my master's research about the painters, I understood that some of the early professionals who were creating these displays were artists, or they were theater designers, people who were very used to seeing the world in a very particular way, in a kind of a framed way almost. And so, yeah, I took a very visual studies kind of approach to it, and thought about, okay, what are the underlying visual principles by which people are creating these displays? What are the tropes or the conventions that they're relying on? Because it's a new kind of material, but they're representing it in ways that have already been done. So I really wanted to look at that in more detail. And so the division of the chapters basically comes out of that. So it's like, okay, well, we have this thing, but we've seen it in the context of the shop, or we've seen it in the context of a painting, or we've seen it in the context of theater, or we've seen it in the context of actually being worn on a real body. So how can we, in a museum context, replicate that rather than creating a museum specific visuality, which I think is something that is only now becoming prevalent.
Yeah, and I really loved that you were able to identify these various ways in which we've displayed fashion, and also show us that we've been working within those various means for at least a century, if not longer. And I thought it was so fascinating because, to me, having worked as a curator for more than a decade now, this is the kind of thing that I need to be reminded of. You know, it's like all of this kind of stuff is new, and you really have to think through curating in a very different way when you're just starting as opposed to when you have more experience. And to me, it was a real refresher, but also critical. And I don't mean critical in a negative sense, but in a way that you were actually identifying what we're doing and how we may be able to kind of think outside of what we've been doing for so long to push fashion exhibitions forward. And I really appreciated that.
I mean, there's nothing to say that what we have been like, that repeating things that have been done before is wrong or bad, because this is true. We do see fashion in these particular contexts that is honest to the history of the object. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it does get a little frustrating when you're digging through archives for museum after museum and you're like, oh, they did another underwear show. And you sort of, I keep thinking of that scene in The Devil Wears Prada of like florals for spring, groundbreaking, right? And you're just like, oh my God, no, not again. Oh, the Victorian, oh, again. Which you can do, you can keep doing that, but like be aware of what came before, and maybe you can contribute something of your own. Like, yeah, it's easy and that's fine, but then don't say that you're doing something new either.
Exactly. And I think my rule talking about fashion history, fashion exhibitions, I never say anything's the first. And I don't like to talk about things being new, because we all know that's leading up to finding something that proves you wrong.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I was stunned when I was doing my research and I found this fashion exhibition from 1833, and I was like, what? Because I'd never heard of anything that early. Obviously there's the descriptions, the kind of like comedic, oh, wouldn't it be funny if we had a fashion museum, or there's things like exhibitions in industrial contexts, like saying, oh, here are the latest fashion wares. But specifically fashion history exhibit 1833, that's mind-blowing, right? But so many of the same conventions that we use today used then. So we have these realistic mannequins that are styled to look like the people of the period. There are accessories. It's probably sponsored. There's celebrity guests that come. It's timed. The exhibition itself is timed to coincide with the fashionable social season, so that the important people come to it. So it's like, yeah, this is all the same stuff we're doing now. And that was 1833.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Was there any exhibitions that you read about or learned about that but weren't ever able to find any photos? I mean, was that one of them, the 1833?
Well, yeah, obviously. Yeah. Apparently, yeah, I would, there is a catalog of it, but it only has text. It doesn't have any illustrations, which is very sad. There were pictures that I found that were sort of orphan pictures. So it's kind of the opposite of what you're asking, actually. So like I went to the ROM, for example, and there was images. They have exhibition binders like most museums do. And there was black and white pictures of their textile galleries. And it said that it was one exhibition, but it clearly wasn't. It was another, but there was no text associated with it. I don't know what exhibit this was. So it was those things that were really frustrating. It's like, clearly this has happened, but there isn't enough documentation to know what it was, who was responsible. This was the other thing that was really frustrating. Authorship of fashion exhibitions is so hard to pin down. You know, a lot of the literature is like the curator. Now, half the time, the museum themselves don't know who the curator was, because there aren't really good records for who was in charge of a particular department at a particular time. Often because it's, you know, women that started as volunteers. Maybe they were the wife of another staff member, and they were sort of put in charge of the frocks, and off you go. And then, so even the names of the person whose conceptual idea was, never mind the designers, never mind the people that actually mounted the objects or conservators or anything. There's just no trail of being able to figure out who did this. And so because, and that's sad, not only because all these people's contributions were kind of essentially lost, but also because you learn so much about why they do the things they do by knowing where they came from. Like, why we're doing this getting to know you session. Like, I was trained as an art historian. I look at things in a particular way. Dorothy Burnham, more of at the ROM, you know, archaeologists, anthropologists. She and her husband did a lot of work that way. So, you know, her work is informed by that disciplinary angle. I want to know more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's got to be so frustrating. But was there anything that you were able to identify that was kind of this orphaned image, and then eventually
well, not an orphaned image. Okay, so I was really excited to find this image.
Ooh.
Not a very exciting image in and of itself, but in 1911, 1912, the Museum of London, then called the London Museum, opened, and it included fashion galleries for the very first time. Basically, in any museum's history, they had this very specific gallery dedicated to this topic. And the review mentioned that they didn't like the display. They were like, well, it's just a bunch of shoes, and the Tudor caps, which were archaeological, they were dug out from things like the side of the Thames and that kind of thing. You know, there's nothing fundamentally new about their display. They were on these roughly carved wooden heads, and you know, it was a pretty snotty review. And it was like, oh man, I wish I could see what these roughly carved wooden heads actually look like. So I contacted the Museum of London, and although I had done lots of research in their archives before, I'd never seen this, but I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it one more try. And so I contacted their image researcher, and he found it. He found this picture, and I was like, yes! I didn't know it existed, and I was so thrilled that it did exist. And there's another version of that picture, and so you know, it's a picture of this very first museum display of fashion.
That is incredible. That's really cool.
Now let's look at it much cooler.
Maybe I'm a dork, but I think it's cool anyway. Well, we know I'm a dork, so that's not a question. And one last question, Julia, before we'll let you go back to your regular day job. I would love to hear from you, since you're a reviews editor, and because you obviously have so much information and have done so much research on fashion exhibitions, what makes a good review? Like, if we're going through a show and we want to write about it, what kind of elements would you suggest we think about and touch upon?
So one of the things for dress, and I love this, is that you have to include at least one image with your review. So just as we were talking about, exhibits are ephemeral. They're only up for a few months, maybe a few years at the outside, and then they're gone. And I would love to see what some of these exhibits looked like, but now I don't know. But we are fortunate enough to have lots of imaging technology, so having that in a review is really key. Having a sense of the conceptual basis of the show, so that's usually somewhere in the introductory panel. What is it that the curator says the show is about? And then what kinds of objects are in it? How are they displayed? Are you, as someone who's going through this exhibit, convinced? Is that the message that you got? Or did you get something else out of it? Which is okay. Like, you can always get something else out of it. But is there something that you would have wanted to see? Is there something that you saw in a different exhibit that maybe worked better? So creating a kind of a dialogue, describing, and then going like that one step further and saying, well, what if they had had unlimited time, money, access to materials, etc.? What would our dream version of this be as well? And I love reading reviews of the same exhibit, but by different people as well, because obviously people come from different backgrounds. So somebody with an art history background like me might be focused on one thing. Somebody who's really interested in construction might be interested in another thing. Somebody who's interested in marketing will see a totally third kind of exhibit. So don't be afraid of writing exhibit reviews. Just because someone's written it for another journal doesn't mean that, I won't be interested, etc. And now in the time of COVID, virtual exhibits. We're all trying to get content online. We're all trying to figure out how to make it relatable and relevant and engaging to audiences who are sitting at home. And how do you make a virtual fashion exhibit stand out from the mass of other visual content that is available out there for consumers? So getting that discussion going, I think, is really important. So like I posted on the Costume Society of America Facebook yesterday going, please, if you visited a virtual fashion exhibit, write a review, and I'll tell all of you, please do.
Great. Well, thank you.
I'm not, unlike Fashioning Horror, I will not force you to write 5 drafts.
Or even so. I love a good 5 drafts myself. I really do. Well, thank you so much, Julia. It was great to see your face, and
yeah,
also
it's lovely to see you guys, and thank you for doing this. Like I was saying before we started, like, it's so cool that someone like me in Edmonton in Canada can be part of this, because the face-to-face kind of New York-based things are great, but it's also lovely to engage with people all over the world. So
exactly, I agree. The one kind of silver lining we can find from this moment.
yes.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. I think we're going to try to do at least a couple more of these. Is that right, April? So keep an eye on our Instagram page, etc., and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.